we are recording on Friday. The governor of Georgia has just declared a state of emergency to bring in 1,000 National Guardsmen, presumably to do what ultimately they're going to be training a bunch of police to do, which is to control people in the community and prevent them from having any type of say in this. Like you said, 17 hours of debate, and suddenly 400 acres that were designated for a more community-oriented purposes turn into a police training facility. And this is also coming in the wake of the police killing of someone who went by the name of Tortuguita. Can you give us, well, before we get there, tell us what the community's been doing. I know that the Beloved of Community Ministries have been involved in this, that the community movement builders have been involved in this, that there's been a coalition to form Stop Cop City, and in conjunction with Defend Atlanta Force. Tell us about the resistance that has grown up over the past almost 2 years now to this plan.
Well, yes. One thing that I always like to distinguish about, for instance, Stop Cop City or Defend the Atlanta Forest, it's often thought of as an organization in the media. And I think that's very important for us to disambiguate, because it's more so a political stance or a movement, right? So it would be akin to saying that somebody is a member of pro-choice, right?
Right.
It's more so like it's like we're all a part of this effort to stop Cop City and defend the Atlanta Forest. And that's important because the way in which the police and federal agents and also the GBI have been moving has been threatening anybody that's associated with the movement as a part of a domestic terrorist network, right? So it's very important to note that this is not an organization, because they're trying to essentially create connections that aren't there. This has been a decentralized and autonomous movement. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, to be clear, I just want people to understand that that is not a theoretical situation. There have been 18 people who have been now charged with being domestic terrorists for supposedly belonging to a so-called domestic terrorist group, when in fact what we're talking about is really just people who are on a side of an issue that exists.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. Good old Georgia. Nevertheless, here we are. And what's happening now is I think that they've been losing in a lot of ways, and they're starting to show it. Just to give a little bit of context, this has been a decentralized and autonomous movement from the very beginning. Now, mind you, before any of this has happened, we have canvassed the neighborhood. We have been petitioning elected officials in DeKalb County, unincorporated DeKalb, where this land actually is, as well as in the city of Atlanta. There was 17 hours, a record amount of public comment, where 70% of it was against Cop City. However, it was almost an inverse correlation with the votes of the city council, where 10 out of 14, about 70%, voted for Cop City. This goes back to a Princeton study in 2016 that established that there's virtually no correlation between public opinion and legislation. In fact, that study also found that about 90% of us have virtually no say in our government, right? So we're looking at, once again, these issues of wealth and influence in the halls of power. So we've been going through, all of these channels. People have been doing tons of protests, marches, everything like that. And then perhaps there's been a little bit of trickery, right? You've had some instances of perhaps equipment being vandalized or things like that. And let's be frank, if we're looking at this empirically, these uses of force have been the only thing that have slowed this project down, and people sitting in trees. Now, just to note, on December 15th, people were pepper sprayed, shot with rubber bullets, and forcibly taken out of trees to then be charged with domestic terrorism, right? And to be quite frank with you, I believe that people being forcibly yanked out of trees and being charged with domestic terrorism, just for holding a certain issue where people that were being yanked out of a parking lot and then charged with domestic terrorism is much more in line with the definition of terrorism by threatening people for taking a political stance than the people that are actually sitting in the trees minding their own business, right? So we're just seeing the asymmetry of who's allowed to make these calls. And so we're just seeing immense abuses of power at the same time that, I mean, let's be clear, they are showing you right now what they plan on doing with this facility, right? They're using overwhelming force to attack people. And there's not really one precedent of a police officer being hurt throughout this entire ordeal up until these very questionable circumstances around Tortuguita's death. God bless them. And then also, like, we have to keep in mind that especially like as we've moved forward with this movement and gained ground, the violence and the harassment has had an uptick.
Right.
And then also with that, they've essentially indiscriminately applied these charges to everybody. So what we have is significant abuses of force and indiscriminate charges, right, against people for virtually having some association with a political position. This is what happens in fascism. So like for us to like have this like some notion that somehow they're going to completely flip the script and then use this facility to make police nicer, I mean, it's such a farce. But these are the things that even liberal politicians will try to convince themselves of, and it's never true.
You know, it's what is fascinating about what we're watching. Well, there's many things, and I do want to get to Tortuguita's killing, which, you know, conveniently was not on body cam, although there were cams there. This dynamic of peaceful protests that are taking place, really no threat to any living human being, anyways, and the force that is being brought out, and it is sort of, there is an irony that this force is being used to essentially develop a facility to train forces like this and presumably do the similar thing.
That's exactly what they're doing.
And the classification of domestic terrorists who are engaged in this. I remember, and if I'm not mistaken, it was in Georgia. That in the mid-aughts, there were vegans who were protesting a honey-baked ham facility, and they were labeled by the Department of Homeland Security as domestic terrorists. And it's as if we're watching, like, you know, these things that were, you know, gamed out for vegans, and particularly, you know, the fact is, almost 20 years ago, the idea of vegans was, I mean, there were vegetarians, but you know, there was no groundswell. It was not a mainstream thing to be a vegan necessarily at that time. And the idea that was almost like a dry run, and we're going to take that playbook and we're going to impose it on people who are literally just camping in the woods. I watched a clip from The Daily Show of like a visit to the encampment, and it was, there's bingo night, there's people camping out. I mean, I've been to more threatening, you know, RV stops, frankly, in the past, and to mobilize 1,000 National Guardsmen just gives you an a taste of what's going on here. So explain the circumstances in which one of these protesters, Tortuguita, was killed by police in a raid on this camp.
Yes. Well, I think there's a couple of things that have to be noted about that instance. First, we have the issue of the inconsistency within perhaps 2 hours of the murder. One, we don't even know if Tortuguita could have been saved. There was never a chance, there was never a shot. Meanwhile, the entire highway was shut down to get this Georgia State trooper to the hospital. So we already have a lack of clarity there. Initially, it was said that folks were ambushed by this person and then they shot. Within 2 hours, the narrative changed to this person being approached in a tent and shooting. I don't know how you ambush someone while you're in a tent.
Right.
It doesn't add up. Then in the initial items that were collected at the crime scene, there was no gun. Then I guess some folks backtrack, maybe produce a registration that then comes up with the gun. Now let's also keep something in mind. We do have precedent of the police pointing firearms at protesters and even using rubber bullets. So there are significant, threats to folks' lives that have already been out there, and pointed weapons and weapons that were fired. So if we live in a society where people can constantly make excuses for police officers that have very specialized training to handle crisis situations, to shoot kids, then I also think that there are some circumstances where someone who has a gun may adequately feel fear for their life and shoot back. These are the things that hit people viscerally and sound very strange. But let's be very clear that somebody can feel in fear of their life and be wrongfully targeted by police and perhaps shoot a shot. And I don't think that I'm not going to get into the game where we just immediately dismiss somebody as bad because they defended themselves, when the legitimate moral authority is certainly not in the hands of the police in so many of these circumstances where there are always shifting narratives. So the evidence around Tortuguita's murder is already very dicey. And I'm also not going to condemn them if they defended themselves.
And explain to me what has come out in terms of the body cam footage, because there's supposedly some footage that existed, but not with the people, not with the cops who approached the tent.
Well, yeah, it's all quite dicey, right? You had several different people from different departments and entities that were in the woods that day, besides Georgia State Patrol. Georgia State Patrol has been under significant scrutiny for years because of their unwillingness to wear body cameras. And there have already been instances where they have shot people out of frame with no context, and there's no explanation. In many cases where no one else fired a shot. So this has been an issue of contention where they will not wear them. And they
coincidentally were the ones who were, I guess, you could say, theoretically on the front lines. They were closest to the incident, and they're
highway patrol. Why are they in the forest?
Right.
We already have people with SWAT and militarized gear and camo. There's no precedent of any police being attacked, but they had a huge bomb squad RV out there. I couldn't exaggerate how much militarized equipment they had around the forest in the past 8 weeks, and it's only expanding. Why do police need tanks? What credible threat is there, in our population that would require that of police? It's too dicey. We're treating policing in this country as if it's some type of video game, constantly making clear villains out of anybody that is pushing back against the will of the state that's becoming more paranoid and more dangerous, and killing people at will and then making excuses for it.
What? How many people now were living in the forest as a means of protecting the property from being developed, and how many are there now? Give me a sense of what's happening in the wake of this killing, and now I guess I guess it remains to be seen what the response is going to be to the state of emergency that's been called, and the mobilization of 1,000 troops. I mean, it's nuts to me. They're obviously trying to bring in sort of, this is almost a shock and awe campaign, as it were. What what is the state of the protests that are going on, to the extent that you can? I imagine, like,
I can't. I was just going to tell you, I can't answer the first part of that question. And then also, I really can't answer the second part of that question, because here is the thing, right? Generally, people ask protesters how they are going to respond. But quite frankly, we never really dictate those terms, because it's the state that's using the violence. Right. And I'm not going to condemn people for defending themselves. I'm not going to do it. And I mean, folks have just been so heavy-handed. And I think that people have the right to protest this encampment. We went through all like legal channels and discourse. And if we have any value in civil disobedience and human life, we would not expect that of people. Because what we have seen empirically is that all of these legal channels that were laid out for us have not worked. And then to ask people to be silently mowed down and treated as if they are nothing and that their humanity does not matter, I'm not going to do it.